The phone slammed into his palm like an accusation. Vincenzo Moretti listened to the hollow ring in the darkened study. One ring, two, and felt the old tightness that lived at the back of his throat, the muscle that had learned to choke off questions before they could bloom. "Enzo," he said, voice a blade made softer by habit, "come to my office." He imagined the man's slow walk, the way Enzo kept his hands at his sides, always ready. He imagined sliding the final paper across the desk, the name circled in red. He had decided it was time. After the Ardente massacre, after the lieutenant who vanished with the accounts, loyalty would be trimmed like bad fruit. Enzo had been at his side for 20 years, silent, watchful, unflinching. But the ledger demanded a clean line. He waited for the one-syllable acknowledgement he trusted like a heartbeat. Nothing answered but the city, thinking it could swallow the fact of betrayal along with its breath. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. The voice that spoke then was younger than the type Vincenzo expected. No gravel, fewer miles, and an urgency that tasted like vinegar. "Don Moretti," it said, polite against the background noise of a small apartment. A radio playing low, the hiss of rain, a child's chamber clock ticking in the next room. "This is Marco. Enzo, he can't come to the phone. He's—" The breath he drew was a promise and an accusation. "He's with the Don's child." Vincenzo's hand tightened until the desk creaked. For a man who had built empire out of numbers and names, the word child had the chemistry of dynamite.
Everything he had made, territories, alliances, loyalty bought and coerced, had been assembled under the assumption that blood was private business, not a line item for rivals to exploit. He had left things in a blur years ago, decisions made in the clamor of war and safety. A child? He tasted betrayal like iron. "You lie," he said, but the tremor in his voice gave him away. "No, Don." Marco's voice didn't flinch. "Enzo's been guarding the baby for years. It's my mother. She said you couldn't know. She said men like you can't take what isn't ready to be taken back." There was a quality of reverence in his words and a defiance that made Vincenzo imagine the boy standing in the doorway of his life, a single candle daring a storm. Enzo swore on her name. He swore he'd keep him hidden. I'm not asking. I'm telling you. Enzo can't come to your office because he's holding your son." The apartment where Marco stood was a place of soft poverty and louder love, a narrow space near the docks where the sea's taste never quite left the sheets, and the neighbors knew how to trade bread when the electric bill loomed. Marco embodied that place, hands calloused from work at the warehouse and from the training his father had given him. He had learned weight and distance, the geometry of standing between a threat and a person. He had also learned to carry secrets like a second skin. Enzo had raised him in ways that blurred lines, teaching him how to load a gun and how to hold a child's hand, while explaining in the same breath the path of loyalty. He had believed Enzo to be his father because longing had a faster current than paperwork. Vincenzo had spent the years since the disappearance of his lover building armor. He took the city into his hands and named it his. Yet the old wound, soft, human, had never healed, had been pressed under ledgers and inventory, under violence and an iron will that operated like a prayer for absolution through control.
The news in Marco's voice tore that scab open in a way counting could not. The Don became a man reeling, and a calculation pulsed. If true, this changed his claims on everything: friends, enemies, successors. The quiet way power passed in whispers, not explanations. "Bring him to me,"
he said at last, because men of power always start with commands, even when their heart is rawer than the marble on their desks. Now, both of them. Marco hesitated like a shutter in high wind. It's not safe, Don. There are eyes. Capitano Russo, he's been trading with Ardente. He swallowed, the syllables thick. Vincenzo knew Russo. He knew corruption when it walked and called itself business. I can't move them into your hands, not like that. Enzo said it would be blood. He said it would be better if it stayed hidden. Vincenzo's mouth went dry. You're making a decision for me, boy. I'm trying to keep them alive, Marco said. Enzo taught me. He taught me everything he thought I'd need. There was that quiet, iron patience that made Vincenzo imagine Enzo's broad back, the old guard's stubborn trust. I won't let you send him away. I won't. Send him away? Vincenzo laughed, a low, dangerous sound. You think I'm here to father a child, like some charity project? The heat of his anger came with old rules. Children of convenience were liabilities. Children of blood were threats until proven otherwise. He had made an empire by not letting tenderness rule. If this is a test, if Enzo has been diluting duty with sentiment, I'll not be made laughable. It's no test. The voice on the phone was unflinching, and in that hour, Vincenzo felt, for the first time, the odd sensation of being less the architect of the room than an intruder into something private. My mother, she's dead. She named you to me once in whispers. She said you were the man with the scar on his face who kissed her by the harbor and promised he'd come back. She said she couldn't keep the boy and that Enzo would keep him safe. He did. For 20 years, he kept him safe. Silence on the other end built pressure until Vincenzo's sternum ached. He could see the faces of his capos, the ledgers, the thin men ready to bend to his will. He thought of the Ardente massacre and the price he'd paid. The sound of a child's laugh was a foreign noise in the records he kept. Yet, the more he tried to catalog this as another resource to manage, the more unaccountable the feeling in his chest became. He was a man accustomed to making people confess in interrogation chairs or through pain, not through a revelation that came like water leaking into a foundation. Bring me proof, he said finally. A name, a place. I will not be blackmailed by sentiment. Proof. Marco's laugh had the bright, brittle edge of someone who had practiced courage in the light of necessity. Come to Via dei Pescatori tonight. There will be a man with a green scarf. Hell show you the boy. If you try anything, if you make a move that puts the baby in danger, Enzo will do what he swore he'd do. He didn't swear to you, Don. He swore to her. Vincenzo's throat made a small noise, something like a surrender and like a threat. He was a man of choices, and now a choice propped itself before him as a ditch or a bridge. He could walk away, order Enzo fired in his absence, brand him a liability, cut loose the secret as he had cut loose everything else that no longer served the balance. He could take the boy into his world and expose him to the machinery of his life, schooling, naming, enemies' knives. Or he could do something he had not done in decades, downplay power and meet a truth with openness. The last option was dangerous in a way ledgers did not capture. It required vulnerability, the exposure of a wound he'd hidden even from himself. Bring him to me, Vincenzo repeated more slowly. 1 hour. If it's a lie, if you're playing me, I'll make you regret the sound of my name. Marco's reply was a simple, fierce, understood. Then, the line clicked dead, leaving Vincenzo in a study that smelled of old tobacco and the ocean. The city hummed outside. Indifferent, but inside his chest something had shifted. An old calculation had been made obsolete by a child's heartbeat. Enzo's face floated into his mind, stoic, scarred, a man who had stood between bullets and the men who slept in Vincenzo's inner circle. He had been loyal for years, not out of fear, but out of a debt to a woman whose name Vincenzo had not spoken in 20 years. Vincenzo tried to catalog options, like books on a shelf, but the thought of Enzo with his back to the world, keeping a child, his child, alive in secrecy, struck him with a more human pain than any that had come from rival bullets or betrayals. He had made enemies into footnotes and lovers into mistakes. Now, suddenly, the ledger contained a line he hadn't authorized. The old code demanded a harsh answer. Any man who kept a secret that could fracture alliances had to be punished to preserve order. Yet the other code, the one buried under uniforms and threats, pulsed like a stubborn ember. A debt paid cannot be erased by money. Outside, a siren wailed to a rhythm that made Vincenzo's bones ache. He rose and walked to the window, the city below a map of pockets and loyalties, of bloodlines and debts. The docks gleamed, the river like a black vein. If he walked into Via dei Pescatori in an hour, he would be facing not just a young man with a green scarf and a lie to disprove, but the living proof of a life he'd once chosen to abandon. He felt the old code tighten around his jaw. For a man who had learned to command storms through rumor and fear, the prospect of asking for mercy was a humiliation he was not keen to taste. But there was another hunger in him now, to see the child, to name what had been unnamed. He poured himself a whiskey, watched it catch the lamplight like a small private sun, and for the first time in decades allowed the idea that the ledger might balance differently. He had forged an empire by refusing softness. To walk toward this possibility was to risk collapse. Yet the alternative, ordering Enzo gone, burning the man who had kept his shame safe, would announce him as a boss who could be manipulated, a man whose private life could be weaponized by rivals. When the clock on the mantel chimed the half-hour, Vincenzo buttoned his coat with hands that had held weapons and made deals, with fingers that had long ago learned to make promises without warmth. He stepped out into a night that had a taste of rain, and in the shadowed streets he felt the old world watching. The captains who fed on weakness, the capos who smelled a shift like blood. Via dei Pescatori waited like a stage, small and treacherous. He had given an order to be obeyed, and now obedience summoned him into an unfamiliar theater, one where a boy with a green scarf dared a don to choose between empire and a son he might never have wanted, but might now need. The choice hung between them like a gun on a table, a final act or an irreparable fracture. Vincenzo set his jaw and walked toward the docks, toward a revelation that would unsettle the city and unmake certain certainties. The docks smelled of oil, wet rope, and something older, salt that had soaked into the bones of the city and wouldn't wash out. Rain streaked the lamplight into trembling columns. Vincenzo stood under the lean awning of a shuttered cafe and watched the figure with the green scarf approach, shoulders hunched against the night. The man moved like someone carrying a secret in his chest and not wanting it to spill. He was smaller than Vincenzo had imagined, thinner, with the careful gait of someone who had learned to keep his weight forward to protect something behind him. The child dozed against his chest, bundled in a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and laundry soap. Marco's face showed at the edge of the scarf, a jawline too familiar to be only resemblance, eyes set in a line of determination that belonged to the docks. He stopped a respectful distance from Vincenzo and folded his hands as if in a ceremony. The Don's first look was professional, an inventory of threats, of who in the small crowd could be an enemy, of the shadows between the warehouses. The child, however, stole his attention like an accusation. For a heartbeat, Vincenzo allowed himself one unmeasured thing,
To look at the boy's cheek, soft and unscarred, and remember a face he had not allowed himself to keep. The resemblance was not dramatic. It was a thing of small alignments, the curve of an eyebrow, the shape of a mouth when the child stirred and sighed in his sleep. It could be coincidence, or it could be everything. Marco's voice was low and steady. "Don Moretti, thank you for coming." "Don't thank me," Vincenzo said. His voice had the trained flatness of a man who learned to hide weather from expression. "Where is Enzo?" Marco's eyes flicked to the shadow behind a stack of crates, and for the first time the Don noticed movement. Long, deliberate, the outline of a broad shoulder. Enzo did not step out. He did not need to. The man had been a ghost for years, the type that made an enemy's throat close before a word was spoken. From the darkness, he watched. A line of muscle tightened in his jaw. He was not a man who sought the light. "Enzo is close," Marco said. "Always." They talked as if they were haggling for a ledger item. Names, dates, places. Marco gave the story in the quick, precise speech of someone who had rehearsed survival. His mother, non-existent in Vincenzo's court, had loved and been ashamed, had given her son to the care of a man she trusted when she believed the world would take him. She had named Vincenzo in a whisper because she wanted her child to have a name that belonged to a man of power, if only to protect him from the world's cruelty. She had been wrong or brave. Whether wrong or brave, she had died keeping a truth from the man who, by right of blood or mistake, was the father. Vincenzo asked about proof, the kind that could be put in front of capos and not dissolved by rumor. He had men who would invent proof as easily as they invented alibis. What Marco offered was a small item, a strip of dark cloth with a burn along the edge, kept in a child's shoebox, a hand-drawn sketch of the boy done by a woman who had taught Sunday school in the parish and had an unsteady hand but a true memory for eyes. It was not the kind of proof that would unmake an empire, but it was personal, human, and impossible to dismiss without making a man appear monstrous in front of others. Vincenzo held the cloth and felt shame like cold metal against his palm. He had no story for the strip of fabric, except the one where a woman smiled and told him to leave and never return. He had chosen the ledger long ago. He had not authorized the cost of a child. "You want me to believe 3 pieces of scrap?" he asked. His tone didn't try for cruelty. It tried for the pragmatic calm a man uses to measure risk. "Bring this to Matteo. Let him adjudicate. If there's a shred of falsity, I will." "You don't see it, Don," Marco interrupted. There was a flash of heat in his voice, anger braided to a newborn fear. "You can send Matteo, you can send soldiers, but you are not the one who has been in the room at 2 in the morning when the boy wakes and cries for the sea. You are not the man who has sat in a narrow kitchen with Enzo and heard him whisper her name and make a promise. Enzo isn't a ledger. He's a man who did what men sometimes do when a woman's voice is all they have left." Those words, "not a ledger," landed in Vincenzo like a thrown stone. He had reduced people to ledger lines for so long, he had forgotten the sound of being argued with like a human. The instinct that had made him great and feared wanted to cut the boy down with the reputation of his name. The other instinct, one as shy and dangerous as a sleeping animal, wanted to ask Enzo, to kneel and beg for an answer that would let him hold a child he had never named. A shadow shifted near the far end of the pier. Vincenzo's men had been instructed to remain at a discreet distance, but loyalty is a crooked thing. Some interpreted discreet as in sight and ready. Among them, a lieutenant he trusted, Matteo, walked forward. Matteo had eyes that could find lies in the dark. His devotion had the polish of ambition. Vincenzo watched him intently, gauging whether the lieutenant's face would give away a plan he had not consented to. Matteo's expression was unreadable for a beat. Then he stepped close enough for Vincenzo to see the thinness of his lips. "Don," he said, polite to the point of steel, "you should take the child. It would be safer under your roof for the time being." Behind Matteo's argument, Vincenzo smelled calculation. This was a man who had blade interests and alliances in every drawer. To take the child would be to pull a string that might reveal the movement of more bones. Bringing the boy into his house would place him at the center of the machine. It would show the city that Vincenzo had accepted the truth and therefore opened himself to scrutiny. To refuse would brand him cowardly and perhaps cruel, and cruelty in a man of his standing must be measured, not impulsive. "Why should I trust Matteo's judgment?" Marco demanded. His protectiveness flared. When words failed, he used tone like a weapon. "He's your lieutenant. He has his eyes on something else." Vincenzo looked from Marco to Matteo. The air had the tightness of a room that had been closed for too long. It felt as if, at any second, a match might be struck and the paper caught. He inhaled the sea salt and the diesel and thought of how many men he had sent away in the past for less human, less true. He had always favored iron laws. Tonight, iron did not answer the soft questions. The child stirred and opened sleepy eyes, making a small sound like a question for which none of them had a ready answer. The resemblance clung like a shadow. "Not here," Vincenzo said finally. "We do this in a way that keeps the child alive and does not hand the city a scandal. I'll take him to my house for the night. I'll have a doctor confirm what needs confirming. Matteo will escort them. If Enzo has been deceiving me, if this is a play by Ardente to make me look weak, you think they'd stoop to an infant?" Marcos's face was pale. "These men, they know where to hit. They know it's cleaner to make you feel like a man who cannot tell his own blood. That's what they want." "They know nothing I don't already know," Vincenzo said. The command was automatic, but the admission trembled in the air between them like a veiled confession. He had been surprised by his own tenderness, surprised by how quickly the idea of holding a child could overturn months of calculation. A lifetime of decisions had been made on the basis of fear and leverage. This one was moving towards something else. Name it weakness, call it need. He did not know yet if he would regret it. Matteo bowed, too eager by half. "We move now, Don. Slow, careful. Enzo will come forward when he sees it is safe." Marcos hesitated. "Enzo will not come out into the open if the child is threatened," he said. "He'll pull back. He promised her he would never let a blade taste his back if it meant the boy's life." "Then let him stay in the dark if he wants," Vincenzo replied, which was both command and a test. "Enzo will keep his promise, so long as the boy is kept from harm." Marcos's jaw tightened. He looked like a man who had been told to trade the last coin for the life of the only thing he loved. "I will not," he began. "You will not what?" Vincenzo asked softly, and the softness in his voice cut in a way louder than rage. Marco flinched. He realized his position. He could defy the Don and risk not only his head, but the child's safety. Or he could obey and place the boy within the very machine that had made the mother choose secrecy in the first place. "The choice is yours," Marco said. He had come to the docks prepared to stake everything. He had not expected Vincenzo's softness to be a weapon of its own. Marco could not know whether Vincenzo's kindness tonight was genuine or a trick. He could see the world as a shepherd sees wolves, and his instinct screamed that wolves wore suits as often as they wore furs. He turned then and stepped back where the shadow made a space wide enough for two people to breathe. And in that movement, Vincenzo saw the boy's fingers curl, small as the loop of a promise. The Don walked forward and reached out with a hand that had nodded with years of command. He touched the child's cheek with the gentleness of someone who had signed death warrants and then found something tender he had no right to. The child's eyes opened, full and dark like ports at night, and for a moment the whole world narrowed to that look. Enzo watched from the darkness, the lie in his life like a live coal beneath skin. He had kept a vow to a woman whose courage had been both fragile and absolute. He had given up a life of easy pay and recognition to sit in the corners and cradle a secret. He had seen men do terrible things to protect empires. He had seen men do terrible things to preserve their reputations. He had chosen a different kind of terrible, a life of quiet terror in which the child's needs were paramount. To be found out now was to risk everything he had hoarded in silence. Vincenzo's hand left the child and settled on his chin as if to weigh a decision. "Matteo," he said, voice reasserting the authority that had not been absent but had softened. "You will take them to my home. You will keep the boy safe. You will not harm the man in the shadows who carried him. You will bring him to me tomorrow. If any harm comes to this child, you will pay for it with everything you own." Matteo bowed and set in motion, but in his eyes something moved, a calculation that smelled like promise and profiteering. Vincenzo noticed it and did not like how easily trust might become currency in a room drained of conscience. Marco matched his breath to Vincenzo's, as if measuring whether different heartbeats could synchronize. "If Enzo won't come forward, will you swear that you will not take the boy and make him a card in your game?" Vincenzo looked at the child, and then at Marco. He had been the architect of men who bent to will. He had not been a man who swore in public. Yet a promise in this moment would be the only thing that might keep the fragile human currency of trust from evaporating. He placed his hand over Marco's in a gesture that was more transaction than tenderness, then allowed something more vulnerable to show. "I swear," he said, each word a landscape he had not wanted to cross. "No games. I will not parade him. He will not be an asset to be traded in the street. He will be safe." Marco's fingers tightened around Vincenzo's and then fell away. There was a wary relief in his face, like a man who had been given a rope with a knot and didn't know whether to trust it. Matteo moved them as promised. The child was carried away on a narrow path between warehouses, the night swallowing small footsteps and the echo of breath. As Vincenzo watched them go, he felt the city's air close in like a fist. He had chosen, for now, to meet a truth he had long ago buried. The decision opened him and exposed him, and that exposure was a vulnerability in a world that traded on being unassailable. It also opened something else, a thin, dangerous line toward possible reconciliation with a part of himself that had been amputated by ambition. Behind him in the darkness, someone whistled a single note, a sound of warning and hunger. Vincenzo turned his head, and for one gilded moment he permitted himself the thought that the act of mercy might be a beginning instead of a trap. Then duty crept back in, cold and unbending. There were men who would use this moment. There was a capitano named Russo whose patience had teeth and whose ambition was like oil on the slimmest of flames. Vincenzo straightened his coat and began the walk back to his car, to the house that had been built on certainty. He had issued an order, not for blood tonight, but for careful watch. It was small and it was huge. The problem was not that he had made the gesture. The problem was that the gesture had already altered the map. The more he tried to measure the consequences, the less they resembled numbers and the more they looked like faces. Enzo's shadowed face, Marco's angry loyalty, the child's sleeping mouth. He had let himself touch a child he might own, and in doing so, he had weakened a wall he had spent decades building. For a man who had always believed in balance sheets,
This night's transaction was likely to be the most expensive yet. He wanted to tell himself he had acted as any sensible leader would, pragmatic, measured, careful. Instead, he felt the first small, terrifying taste of something like hope, or the beginning of a fall. As the rain thickened and the lamps blurred into halos, Vincenzo pulled his collar up and walked toward a car with men whose eyes now held the knowledge that their boss could be moved. In a city that traded in certainty, uncertainty was combustible. The embers of what he had allowed would not be contained easily. He needed to know what Enzo had sworn, why a man who had been by his side for 20 years would guard a secret at such cost, and whether the child sleeping in his car was truly a measure of blood or of a story cruelly spun to break him. Behind him, the docks held their breath. In the spaces between the warehouses, truths shifted like fish beneath the surface, silent, sudden, and impossible to grasp without dirtying your hands. The next move would not belong to Vincenzo alone. It would be a game of men who measured love with the same scales they used to count men. And somewhere in the dark, Enzo had to decide whether he would step into the light and claim the debt that had kept him from rest for 2 decades. The morning after the docks was bright like a betrayal, brittle light that showed edges. Vincenzo woke with it in his eyes, the promise he'd made chilling in his chest like a medal he didn't deserve. He had gone to sleep with a child's small breath still on his skin, an echo that felt as intimate as some last confession. Now the house smelled of coffee and polished wood, of men who had already begun to translate his soft words into strategies. He called a council with the narrow, deliberate movements of a man who needed to corral reaction before it fanned into revolt. Capos gathered in the main room, faces like ledgers, numbers and names and interests neatly stitched across them. They were patient in the way predators pretend to be, waiting to see whether mercy would be a weakness they could use. Matteo stood beside Vincenzo as if carved from the same marble. His expression was small and clean, the look of ambition satisfied by proximity. Vincenzo planted the small box, the scrap of cloth, the child's shoe with the burned edge, on the table between men who had never learned tenderness. He did not cite names. He did not raise his voice. He let the silence do the work of accusation. The room inhaled it and held it. "We keep the child safe," Vincenzo said.
"We do not exploit the boy. Any movement, public or private, that turns him into leverage will be punished." Few of the men looked relieved. Some were openly curious. Matteo's fingers tapped on the table as if he were drumming up a cadence. Under his nails, Vincenzo saw the ink of other loyalties. A quick thought stabbed. What if Matteo's counsel last night had been a way to escort the boy into his hands and then into someone else's? "You took him into your home?" one of the capos asked. He made the question more accusation than inquiry. "I did," Vincenzo answered evenly. "And a doctor will confirm what needs confirming. Blood, age, all of it. Tell the men we're on alert. Capitano Russo has been mixing his words with Ardente. We can't afford a leak." There it was, the name that slid like oil into every conversation. Russo. The captain whose uniform smelled of compromise and whose promises had the texture of bribes. He would be the first to move on any sign of weakness. Vincenzo's men bent toward the edges of the map, ready to adjust, but under their faces were other calculations. Power shifts are breeds of hunger. One man's mercy is another's opportunity. Matteo lifted his eyes to Vincenzo. "If it is true, Don, then showing strength is in your interest. Keeping him hidden places a story in the mouths of our enemies. Better to be the one who decides his fate." Vincenzo watched that look and felt the coldness of a blade passing beneath his ribs. He had offered sanctuary. Matteo perceived leverage. He had given a promise. Matteo could turn it into a marketable rumor. The Don's chest constricted in a way no one present would call tenderness. It was a private, furious thing. "Not yet," Vincenzo said. "We assess. We protect. We don't parade him for politics." The meeting dissolved in the way these things do. Agreements murmured, men dispersing to their businesses like ants returning to different hills. Vincenzo remained seated until the sound of footsteps dwindled. Alone, the house was quieter than he liked. He thought of Marcos's face at the docks, the stubborn clarity in the boy's voice when he listened as if every other voice might steal what he guarded. He thought of Enzo, silent sentinel, secret keeper, and wondered how a man of such constancy could have been moved by love into such a quiet rebellion. He sent for Enzo. The knock on the inner door was the slow, patient sound of someone who kept time by the rhythm of promise. Enzo entered dressed as always, coat buttoned, shoulders square. Up close, his face told stories Vincenzo had not wanted to read. Lines cut into him like chapters, around the mouth, the eyes, the scar at the temple. He did not make excuses. He did not ask for permission to speak. "You kept him," Vincenzo said. The words were not accusation, but astonishment. "For 20 years." Enzo's jaw worked. "She asked me," he said simply. "She begged. She said if I took him, he would live. I told her I'd keep what she couldn't keep. I swore." "To her," Vincenzo said. "Not to me." "No," Enzo admitted. "Not to you." Silence again, but deeper now, a canyon carved by choices. Vincenzo had authority, but he had never had this kind of raw information delivered like a knife to a soft place. He had sent men away for far less. He had made examples out of tenderness. Yet here was a man who had turned rebellion into a vow. "Why?" Vincenzo asked. And the one syllable demanded not just reason, but blood. Enzo's eyes flicked to Vincenzo's hands. "Because she was small in a way you could ruin, and you never saw. Because she loved like a thing you can't buy. Because one night she asked me to make sure the child wouldn't be taken by the world you run. I told her I would. I kept that promise." Vincenzo thought of the woman at the harbor, the brief memory of lips meeting, the night air wet with salt. He remembered a warmth he had not allowed himself to keep, a single vulnerability he had buried under decisions and deaths. Enzo's confession was a simple inauguration of pain. "You put me at risk," Vincenzo said. "There was accusation there, real and sharp. You made this a problem for me. You hid it from me." "I kept a secret to protect a child from the consequences of your choices," Enzo answered. "I did not think of your empire. I thought of the boy's right to a life without being weighed by your name." "Do you know what you have done to my men?" Vincenzo asked. He did not mean only the blood and the trade. He meant the shift in the air, the way loyalty trembled when a boss's choices changed. Enzo had not merely hidden a child. He had given the city a map to test its edges. Enzo's posture did not waver. "I did not sign up to be your ledger," he said. "I signed up to keep a promise." You might have expected those words to pit two men against each other, a Don who kept scores and a bodyguard who had chosen a different morality. Instead, the fracture that followed was not between them, but among those around them. Matteo's betrayal, like a slow leak, had never quite looked like anything until the city took a taste. Vincenzo dispatched men to check the doctor's report, to confirm identity or disprove it. The results, when they came, were clinical and cold. Blood work uncertain in the ways DNA can be because of damp samples and a hurried collection. Enough to suggest relation, not enough to confirm before rumor walked like a child in a square. That ambiguity became capital news for the streets, and rumor gathered teeth. Capitano Russo caught scent of it like a hound. He infiltrated bars and precincts with the easy charm of a corrupt official, telling stories that placed the Don in the light of scandal. Ardente, smelling weakness, sharpened its claws. The city bled gossip and the sound of knives being whetted. Vincenzo tried to lock down information. He ordered silence with the voice that had once made men obey without question. But power is porous, and secrets are like children. Someone always wants to show them off. Matteo, with his careful eyes and hungry hands, saw an opening. A way to attach himself to both the Don and the scandal. To leap from lieutenant to kingmaker. He fed the right people the right half-truths. Enough to make Russo act, not enough to let any loyalty be clean. The fracture deepened not in one dramatic explosion, but in a long erosion. Capos who had weighed their futures in whispers began to call for action. Some argued for parading the child as a symbol of reconciliation, showing the city that Vincenzo's blood would not be denied. Others pushed for a show of force, make a clean cut with Enzo, demonstrate that obedience to the code mattered more than private debt. Marco, listening to these men talk as if they dealt in livestock, felt something inside him snap. He had come to the docks as a guard, as a son who had sworn to protect a secret. He had not come prepared for the politics, for the ways men would trade the child's face for headlines. He found a kind of coldness in himself he had not known he possessed, an edge shaped by fear. "You don't know what he's been," Marco told Matteo one night in a corridor of the Don's house, the light thin and untrusting. "You don't know what Enzo did for him. You call him a thing. You would use him to make yourself richer. You would make my life, my father's life, a joke." Matteo's smile was a sharpened thing. "You think you're protecting something noble?" he said. "But this is our business. Blood helps us. It ties people. It creates claims. Why would I not secure the family name by showing the boy to the world?" "Because your world uses children as proof instead of people," Marco answered. He found irony and fury braided in his speech. "Because you would use him to buy alliances, and I will not let you." The argument did not end with resolution. It ended with realization. Marco and Matteo were now on different maps. The house that had once held loyalty, organized as a geometry of fear, was cracking along fault lines no one had mapped. The fracture between those who saw humanity in the child and those who saw advantage in him widened into a chasm. Men took sides with subtle gestures, an empty chair here, a word withheld there. Vincenzo watched the dividing lines form with a kind of acute grief. He had thought his gesture of mercy might be a bridge. Instead, it was a fault line that revealed where people really stood. Then, as if to crown the disaster, Russo made a move. He planted a story in the precincts that the Don had kidnapped a child and was hiding him to avoid custody disputes with Ardente. The story was crude and salacious. It landed in the newspapers like an accusation, and in the mouths of enemies like a taunt. A public prosecutor in the city, eager for a platform and hungry for headlines, called for an inquiry. The mob responded with the gaudy unpredictability of resentment, chanting in narrow streets. Ardente's men lit fires in alleys and left banners that read more like threats than slogans. The pressure mounted toward a public spectacle, a hearing scheduled with the prosecutor where witnesses would arrive and men would be compelled to speak in front of cameras. Matteo volunteered to bring the evidence. People wanted to see the proof, to confirm that the Don's empire had a human face. Vincenzo and Marco both knew, in the cold way men in their positions know things, that a public performance would invite a dangerous choreography. Ruthless men, hungry cameras, the slippery presence of bullets. Enzo, who had kept his vow in a life of shadow, sat in the kitchen of Matteo's apartment and listened to the noise the city made when it smelled scandal. His hands trembled as he made coffee. He had been a soldier of silence. Now he had to decide whether silence would become a lie that hurt the child he loved. "You could come forward," Marco said, quietly, while they waited.
You could tell them the truth and be punished like a man. You could tell them why she trusted you. Enzo put the cup down without looking up. If I go to the public, I invite knives. If I go to confession, I invite gossip. The worst of it is not their judgment. The worst is that the boy will be taken and turned into leverage. You won't be able to stop them if they want the show, Marco said. I've seen how they work. I know, Enzo said. His face folded with the exhaustion of someone who had kept a secret long past the point where secrecy became a kind of self-punishment. I thought I could keep him safe forever. I thought I was enough. But the world is hungry, and men are wolves. It was the darkest, simplest admission. The lonely burden of sacrifice. Enzo had kept a life that had cost him everything but his conscience. Now the world demanded he trade again, this time not with his body, but with the child's future. He looked at Marco, and for a moment their eyes held the convergence of two paths, one toward quiet disappearance, the other toward a dangerous claim. The night of the hearing, the city turned itself into theater. Streets filled with men whose loyalties were measured in headline currency. Cameras sat like insects, hungry. In the courthouse, Matteo carried the box of evidence like a talisman and placed it on the table with the smugness of a man who had placed his bet. Vincenzo sat in the gallery, cloaked yet exposed, while a line of witnesses stepped forward, some honest, some bribed, some eager to see the Don humiliated. Russo's testimony was careful, polished. He rode the wind of public sentiment. Matteo's statements were surgical. Marco accompanied Enzo in the shadows, their roles singular. One the protector who had always moved unseen. The other, the boy who had protected a secret like it was the only thing that had ever mattered. But the final fracture came not from the loud voices in the room. It came from a single thread pulled by a man who had once sworn loyalty to Vincenzo and now found his fortunes in aligning with the city's appetite for spectacle. A whisper here, a convenient omission there, and the hearing turned from inquiry to accusation. The prosecutor, hungry for the moment of victory, pushed for immediate custody measures. How can a city leave a child in the hands of a man who hid him for 2 decades, he demanded. A panel of judges, frightened of their own reputations, suggested temporary custody to be decided by state services. Enzo listened to the machinery grind and felt his worst fear, losing the boy, become a real, legal possibility. His sacrifice, once a private martyrdom, was folding into a public ritual. He gripped Marco's sleeve until his knuckles went white. "If they take him, they'll not only have a name," he whispered, "they'll have the boy." Marco's hands shook, the kind of raw shaking that only comes from the verge of losing something irreplaceable. He thought of the docks, of the small apartment where a mother had held her son like a sacrament. He thought of his own life, braided with lies but held together by duty. He thought of the Don who had touched the child's cheek and said he would not make him an asset. He found, impossible and stubborn, that he believed that promise. In the courthouse, under the fluorescent layer that flattened humanity and magnified flaws, the city demanded answers.
Men chose sides, friends shifted into enemies. The fracture widened until it was a wound that bled trust and cut the web of loyalty into strips. Outside, Russo smiled like a man who had harvested a field of ripening grain. Inside, Vincenzo sat and watched the theater of his life become spectacle. The fracture the city wanted, clear, consumable, tore at him differently than any rival's bullet. It asked him to choose publicly and irrevocably. It asked him, for the first time, to make a sacrifice not measured in muscle or territory, but in the currency of tender things. And somewhere beyond the judicial halls and the scribes of the press, Enzo and Marco held the line of what they had sworn to protect. The fracture had begun. It would have consequences that would echo in gunfire and in whispered promises. The city itself seemed to tilt, waiting to see whether a dawn could be unmade by a child's face, and whether a bodyguard's vow could stand when the world leaned into spectacle. No one in that room could say how it would end. They only knew that the next moves would not be measured in money or men alone, but in the price a soul would pay for stepping into the light. The shot that cracked the air at the courthouse steps sounded like every decision Vincenzo had ever made finally snapping. He'd left the hearing with his face bare to the cameras, no mask, no practiced indifference, because the only thing left to do now was truth. He had debated words like weapons, rehearsed confessions like alibis, and chosen one that would cost him more than territory. "I am the father," he had told the prosecutor and the press, and the sound of those syllables unmade rooms of speculation into a single, dangerous fact. Men who had measured him by fear now measured him by a new arithmetic. What would he protect, and how much would he pay? Outside, rain had edged the marble steps into slick mirrors. The crowd had pressed in, hungry for scandal, and Russo had watched from the margins with the predator's patience of a man who smells a kill. Matteo stood at the lip of the stairs, his face a plea and a blade, having arranged the performance only he could profit from. Marco was at the perimeter, clenched like a fist. Enzo crouched like a shadow beside him. The child, who had been the soft center of a very hard world, was bundled and close to Marco's chest, a tiny island of breath. When the first gunfire erupted, 2 sharp reports, then a chorus, everything shrank to a handful of urgent frames. Men dove, bodies folded like paper. A policeman went down with a surprised curse. A camera fell and rolled, its lens catching a slow, awful close of faces frozen in the half-light. Vincenzo's first instinct was inventory. Who shot, from where, how many? His second was moral and immediate. He moved not to count, but to cover. He stepped forward in a way he had not stepped for decades. Not as boss to scene, but as man to child. "Down," he roared, the single command that men flinch. A bullet tore through the hem of his coat. The world narrowed to the metallic taste of air and the shredded sound of cloth. He didn't look down. He pushed himself between the little bundled weight in Marco's arms and the direction of the shots. Enzo, without a thought of tactics, launched from shadow to shield, throwing his broad frame toward the child's line like a living barricade. There was always a brutal honesty to men who loved with the muscles. The motion was simple and true. Enzo took the bullet meant for a face no longer anonymous. His body folded around a small life like a gate closing. For a moment, Vincenzo heard everything as if from underwater. The pop of guns, someone screaming Russo's name, Matteo's sudden horrified half-sprint. Then Enzo hit the pavement with a sound that was too small for the life that filled it. Blood darkened his shirt and the rain. Marco dropped to his knees with a cry that was half prayer and half animal anguish. The child, startled awake, made a sound like a bell, and Vincenzo felt that sound like an accusation and an offering.
He moved over Enzo as if all the laws of his world rearranged at the touch of that man's skin. Up close, Enzo's face was a map of choices. Scars, old loyalties, a blankness only tenderness could fill. Vincenzo had sent men to rot for less than what was happening now. He now touched the wound like a confession. "Hold him," Vincenzo told Marco, voice stripped of deniability. Marco did, and the boy clung like a promise. Vincenzo pressed his fingers to Enzo's chest and felt the slow, treacherous rhythm. Then he heard Enzo laugh, which was not the laugh of a man who had surrendered, but of a man who had done what he'd sworn. "You told me to keep him," Enzo murmured, voice thin with pain. "For her." Vincenzo's reply was a thing he had never had the language to say until the world made it necessary. "I will keep him now. All of him." Enzo's eyes searched Vincenzo's face like someone cataloging the final truth. "Not for empire," he breathed. For that boy. Promise me." Vincenzo's hands trembled, the way hands do when power is forced into tenderness. He lowered his face and pressed his forehead to Enzo's, an intimacy that had nothing to do with ranking or code, and everything to do with human reckoning. "I promise," he said, and the words sat between them like a covenant. The sirens grew closer, boots thundered, and Russo's silhouette tried to melt away into the throng. Matteo, who had hoped to profit from a spectacle, knelt too late, his face finally showing something like remorse. Enzo exhaled, a small, almost comical relic of breathing he had kept for years. He smiled, and it was not victorious, but peaceful, like a man who knew he'd finished his task. "You were always the one who could decide," he whispered. "Decide now." Vincenzo felt a burning in his chest that wasn't purely grief. It was a heat that had been lying dormant under ledgers and killings, a recognition that some debts are paid with more than money. He had imagined he could control the ledger and keep his hands clean, but Enzo's sacrifice made cleanliness a mockery. Paramedics snatched at Enzo and lifted him with the reverence of men who carry saints and sinners alike. The child was taken to a waiting car, and Marco rode in the back, whimpering but safe. Vincenzo stood on the drenched marble and watched his world swaddle itself around a single shape, the wounded man who had kept his secret. When the ambulance's taillights bled into the night, Vincenzo made a choice that would be seen as weakness by some and courage by others. He walked into the press of men and put every available resource at the service of a truth that had cost a man his life, or might. He ordered doctors, a quiet room, a chain of protection not for his reputation, but for the child. He named a guardian as if naming a sin. He appointed Marco a place at his table and vowed to keep a promise in public. That night, in a small hospital room bright with antiseptic and the furtive hum of machines, Enzo's hand twitched. Vincenzo, who had never been allowed to be tender without cost, took that hand and did the simplest, most radical thing he could imagine. He stayed. He sat at the head of a bed that smelled of bleach and old vows, and he watched over a man who had loved someone else enough to risk his life. When Enzo opened his eyes, the room softened. Vincenzo bent and kissed the old soldier's forehead, not as boss to man, but as debtor to bone. "You kept him," he said, and the admission was both an apology and a benediction. "I will keep what you kept." Enzo's thumb found Vincenzo's knuckle, the small, honest contact of comrades. "Then don't spend it on fear," he rasped. "Spend it on him." Outside, the city churned with its appetites. Inside, 4 men, Vincenzo, Enzo, Marco, and a small sleeping child, formed a new precarious covenant. Matteo's betrayal had made martyrs or villains of them all. Russo's ambition had been checked by a spectacle of blood that did not serve him as cleanly as he'd hoped. Power had been rerouted through a wound, and the cost would be paid in sleepless nights and guarded streets. Redemption, Vincenzo learned that night, was not a clean ledger entry. It was a decision that required public risk and private courage. He had stepped between a bullet and a child, and in doing so had begun to dismantle the architecture of a life built on fear. The city would not forgive the softness without consequence. Men would still measure him by how he enforced it. But for a moment, sacred and terrible, softness had been his weapon. In the days that followed, alliances shifted around the new fact of a Don who had chosen to protect a face. Some men left, unable to reconcile tenderness with profit. Others stayed, drawn by the strange gravity of a leader who could now be seen as flawed, and therefore, in a paradox that was both dangerous and strangely human, more real. Enzo's wound healed slowly. His sacrifice had given him back an honesty he had not allowed himself to own. He never asked for gratitude. He only asked that the boy live without being made into a prize. Vincenzo kept that promise with a stubbornness that surprised even him. Marco, who had once believed that protection was muscle and training, learned how to trust a man who could both order deaths and cradle a child. The Don's acceptance of the boy rebalanced the house in ways that money couldn't touch. On a quiet afternoon, weeks after the shooting, Vincenzo stood by the crib while Marco rocked the sleeping child. The man who had once reduced the world to ledgers knelt and let the light catch the curve of the boy's cheek. Power had cost him men and nights and a lifetime of easy certainty. But as he watched the child's breath slow and steady, something like a new account opened, one that could not be audited by rivals. He reached out, not to claim, but to belong. Marco slid the child toward him as if testing whether the Don could be trusted with a weight the world revered. The boy's fingers curled around Vincenzo's thumb, small and fierce, and in that tiny grip, the Don felt the final, irrevocable price of his choice. To love was to be vulnerable, and in vulnerability there was a power he had never known how to name. Outside, the city resumed its commerce of favors and threats, but within the walls of one house, under the slow watch of a man who had finally learned to keep a promise beyond profit, a different calculation held sway, one where a child's life could redraw lines and where a boss had laid down an armor to pick up a responsibility. The cost was high, the work was dangerous, and the future remained a map with too few roads. But, for the first time in a long time, Vincenzo walked forward not to conquer, but to protect, and the difference changed everything. Morning came soft as confession. The house had the hush of something consecrated, sheets folded with care, the kettle hissing like an old man's throat clearing. Enzo slept in a chair by the boys' room, his face slack from morphine and the kind of peace that follows exhaustion. Marco moved through the rooms with the precise, protective choreography of a man who had learned to measure danger in seconds. His eyes kept falling to the corridor where Vincenzo stood, a figure somehow less austere and more exposed than ever. They had built a new calendar in the days after the shooting, doctor visits, a private tutor for the child to keep him far from public curiosity. Quiet patrols that went out at odd hours so the house never felt like a fortress but like a home under careful watch. Matteo had been quietly reassigned, sent to a dead-end province where his cleverness would lie fallow, and rumors had a way of thinning when power chose a face to punish. Capitano Russo found his opportunities close like a fist. With the city watching and the Don now humanized, brash corruption was a harder gamble. The gears of the world shifted because a man had chosen tenderness and, in doing so, exposed himself to danger. Vincenzo learned rituals he had thought foreign. He learned the cadence of a child's sighs, the way a hand flutters in sleep like a slow apology. He learned to make broths that smelled like something his mother might have made, simple, warming.
Because Enzo's hands needed comfort beyond the hospital, and because a child deserves the small mercies an empire cannot calculate. He sat with the boy on afternoons and let him sleep on his chest, an arrangement that blurred rank and rewired a life. Marco watched these lessons with a guarded tenderness. He was still the dock worker, still the man who could read an angle of risk, but he softened at the edges. He taught the boy to knot rope, to listen to the river at night, to name gulls. He taught Vincenzo to say small, honest things. "Come with us to the pier next Sunday." Vincenzo, who had always given commands, accepted invitations like a man learning to be invited. Enzo recovered slowly. The scar on his torso would remain, a map of the night he chose love over ledger. He never asked for accolades. He returned, quietly, to the rituals of protection. Only now his vigilance came with a new duty, to be present in the child's life, not as an anonymous guardian, but as kin recognized at last. His hands, which had steadied rifles and tucked blankets, trembled when the boy called him father in a child's experimental way one afternoon. There was no answer needed, only the steady work of returning the name to him. There were quiet reckonings. Men left the house after conversations held at the edge of civility. Others stayed and learned a different grammar of loyalty, one that included mercy. Vincenzo's meetings took on new tones. He still negotiated with a mind like a lockbox, but his promises now had a different currency. They were tempered by the face he had touched in the rain. He spent nights by the window watching the river, the city breathing like a living thing. Sometimes the boy's small hand would find his and wrap fingers around his thumb, as if testing the promise again and again. On a mild afternoon some weeks later, the four of them stepped onto the pier together. The child, bundled in a tiny coat, laughed, an open sound that made passers-by look twice. Vincenzo, who had once measured men by how quickly they bent to his will, watched the boy throw a piece of stale bread to the gulls. Marco taught him to toss it just so. Enzo stood back, hands loose but ready. The wind smelled like salt and new bargains. Vincenzo knelt without drama and let the boy climb into his lap. The child's fingers closed around his thumb with the same small, fierce grip that had once been an accusation and had become an anchor. The Don felt the tug of that grip like a ledger rewriting itself. Accounts closing, debts settling, not with coin, but with care. Around them, the harbor moved on, the ropes, the boats, the work that built cities. But at that moment, under a sky that took in everything and said nothing, a man who had ruled by fear learned how to keep what mattered without using it as a weapon. He did not give away power, he transformed its use. The city would still demand its due. Men would still test and betray. There would be nights where the phone would ring and a choice would have to be made. But on the pier, with the tide turning quietly, Vincenzo felt a small and dangerous peace. A life that had been organized to avoid softness now had a daily, stubborn witness to it. The gulls wheeled, the ropes creaked, the river kept its slow agreement to carry things away. The child pressed his forehead against Vincenzo's, heavy with sleep and trust. Vincenzo closed his eyes and let the sound of the harbor fold over him. Sirens and workmen, bargains and boat horns, until the noise was only the measure of the world, vast and indifferent and, for now, forgiving.